Hi again, third graders. I am wanting to continue the social studies lesson that I started with you yesterday about the Revolutionary War, the American Revolution, where American colonists joined together to fight for freedom from the country of England. And so we're going to continue. What I'm looking at, my camera's kind of going over here, is a painting of George Washington, who is right there with his arm up. He was the leader of the American Army, and this was before we had won the war, so he wasn't our president yet. He will become our first president, and we'll read about that today. But here is a picture of him in his uniform and some, I suppose, other officers, some more important soldiers with him. And then you can kind of see what looks to be some other American colonists there. It says this engraving shows George Washington and his army in Morristown, New Jersey. All right, so I'm going to read here, and we'll stop and chat a little bit along the way. The war begins. The Revolutionary War began in 1775, a year before the Declaration of Independence was written. George Washington was chosen to lead the American troops against Britain. Washington's army was made up of colonists who wanted to help. They were not well trained and sometimes had to get supplies from the towns for which they were fighting. The British soldiers, though, were better trained. Their supplies were sent to them on ships from Britain. The American soldiers fought many battles. They won some, but they lost others. In 1783, the Americans finally won the war and their independence from Britain. The United States is still an independent country today. So if you think back now to what we talked about, I believe it was in 1773 that we had the Boston Tea Party. Yes, I'm turned back a page. 1773, and it wasn't until 1783 that the British surrendered and the Americans won. Now, when the British surrendered, that means they gave in and they didn't fight the American colonies becoming free from Britain. You see, when we wrote the Declaration of Independence, this document that declared that we wanted freedom from the King of England, he didn't just give in and say, okay, it was nice knowing you, good luck. It started a war because Britain, the English King George, didn't want to just let those 13 colonies go. He wasn't just going to say, sure, that's fine, I give up that British land. He didn't do that. So that is why the war was fought. And it wasn't until 10 years after that Boston Tea Party that they surrendered. And it says the actual war itself began in 1775. So if you do the math there, it would be about an 8-year war of actual fighting before the British surrendered. Surrendered means you give up. The picture on the side here shows what an American soldier might have worn, something similar to that. There are some of those clothes still around in museums. I have seen some things. I've seen actual uniforms that belonged to George Washington. When we went out to Washington, D.C. and Virginia 2 summers ago, I was actually able to visit Mount Vernon, the George Washington home, his farm there, and it was a very interesting place to tour. In fact, I will share some pictures with you, and maybe we'll do that next week. So that was a very interesting place to visit. And then some of his things in the national museums in Washington, D.C., the National History Museum, where you can see some very famous things that have been saved from the history of our country. All right, I'm turning the page and I'm going to read this section. New laws are made. After the war, people in the United States could make their own laws. They formed a government for the new nation. However, the new government turned out to be weak. By 1787, the country's leaders decided they needed a new constitution. A constitution is a set of laws that tells how a government will work. The leaders wanted to form a government that was strong enough to get things done, but would not take away freedoms. They met in Philadelphia. to write the Constitution of the United States. In 1789, the Constitution was approved. The Constitution helped found the Republic of the United States. The leaders were proud of the country they had started. A feeling of pride in one's country is called patriotism. If you are a patriot, you are proud to be a citizen of your country. Here is a photograph of the Constitution of the United States. And of course, you can't see all of that writing. When I get closer, it gets blurry. You can't read it, but that is a picture of the original document with signatures, of course, there. And then at the bottom of this page, there is a painting that shows the signing of the Constitution. And that would appear to be George Washington. Probably some very other famous names. That looks like Benjamin Franklin to me, sitting down there. Probably Thomas Jefferson is in that painting. I'm sure we could read more details, but you'll notice it's a room full of men. You don't see women. They dressed in fancy clothing, and you notice their hair is all white. They wore powdered wigs. That was a tradition that came from England, where the men would kind of dress like this and wear these white fancy wigs on their heads, especially when they were in important meetings such as this, when they were doing business. They didn't wear them all the time, but that's why you see a bunch of white heads in that picture. Our first president. The new Constitution said that the people would choose a president or leader for the country. On April 30th, 1789, Americans chose General George Washington to become their first president. He is often called the father of our country. So not only was he chosen to lead the American army in the American Revolution, but after the war was over, actually about 6 years after the war was over, then we chose him to be our first president. You know, there were a lot of decisions that had to be made about our new government. These colonists had been ruled by a king, by King George from another country, but we, as we set up the government for the United States, did not choose a government that had a king or a queen. We chose a government in which we vote as citizens for our leaders, and we still follow that today. Now, there have been changes in our Constitution. There have been changes in the laws that we follow. Back in the day when we were a new country, men were in charge. White men were in charge, to be quite honest. And a lot of things have changed over time, to the point where all United States citizens, regardless of whether you are a man or a woman or the color of your skin, if you are a United States citizen and you are 18 years old or older, you have the right as a citizen to cast your vote. And so there have been a lot of changes, good changes that have happened to make life better and more fair. But there were some people that had to work hard for those rights as well. So in summary, the American colonists fought for freedom from Britain in the Revolutionary War. After the war, their leaders wrote the Constitution of the United States of America. When you are a little older, because I kind of think you would appreciate it more when you're a little older, I hope that you can travel around this country, and I hope that you can visit our nation's capital someday. You know, I have only been to Washington, D.C. once, and that was 2 summers ago. I've always wanted to go, and finally, I went with my husband and my son Hunter, and we did a road trip, and we spent time out east and learning about the early history. I loved every minute of it. I love history. I find it interesting and fascinating, really, to just step into these places where so many important events that kind of formed who we are today as a country happened. And we'll share some more of those stories together. So anyway, this is our topic. We're a new nation, the United States of America. And of course, the United States originally was only 13 states. Those 13 colonies then became states, is what we called them, and there were only 13. As we move forward in history, we're going to learn about how the rest of the states got added and became part of the 50 states that now make up the United States. So thanks for listening and following along.